Hi, my name is Ashley Orr, and I will be reading We the People, the Constitution of the United States by Peter Spier. This book would be most appropriate for 5th graders learning about the U.S. Constitution. We the people of the United States. In order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. The story of our Constitution. The year was 1787. It had been 4 years since the Revolutionary War came to an end, securing America's independence from Great Britain. The United States was a young republic, little more than a loose alliance of 13 independent states governed by their own laws and often at odds with one another. Things were not well with the country. A strong central government did not exist. States acted in their own interest, often against those of the country as a whole, and large war debts had to be repaid. States in need of more funds printed huge quantities of paper money, creating devastating inflation as the prices of goods soared. The people's resentment of their state legislators had risen to a fever pitch. In 1786, armed insurgents, mostly farmers deep in debt, disrupted the Massachusetts Supreme Court and almost captured the nearby U.S. arsenal, which was full of weapons. Despite the bloodshed, the public sympathized so strongly with the uprising that the government pardoned most of the rebels, including Daniel Shays, the rebellion's leader. It had become clear quite early that the Articles of Confederation, an agreement between the states that served as the nation's first constitution, were not enough to establish the strong central authority that was needed. There was even disturbingly serious talk about installing a military dictatorship as the only way to govern the nation in the face of the rising tide of discontent and economic chaos. A call to action. Wisdom and good examples are necessary at this time to rescue the political machine from the impending storm, wrote George Washington to his fellow Virginian James Madison in 1786. Madison had been arguing for a strong national constitution for years. Good sense prevailed, and delegates from 5 states had met in Annapolis, Maryland to discuss solving the nation's horrendous commercial problems. A report on that meeting was promptly submitted to the Continental Congress, the group of state delegates that had been governing the country since 1774. The report urged the Congress to convene delegates from every state to revise the Articles of Confederation. The Congress agreed and summoned the states to a convention. In the spring of 1787, delegates from 12 states began to gather for the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia State House, where 11 years earlier the Declaration of Independence had been signed. Only Rhode Island, the smallest state, refused to send a delegation, fearing that it would lose control over its own affairs to the larger states. But Rhode Islanders were not the only ones with reservations. Patrick Henry did not join the Virginia delegation because he was skeptical of James Madison's forceful ideas for a central government, which he worried would limit the rights of the states. Even the greatly respected George Washington had to be persuaded to come, having retreated to a private life at Mount Vernon, his Virginia plantation after the Revolutionary War. Debate in Philadelphia. Thus, on May 14, 1787, only a handful of delegates assembled in Philadelphia, so that the convention had to be postponed until more arrived. Eventually, 55 delegates attended, although some of the most prominent statesmen in the country were missing. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were serving as ambassadors in Europe. But other powerful giants were there. George Washington, who had changed his mind, James Madison, who would eventually be known as Father of the Constitution, Alexander Hamilton, Gouverneur Morris of Pennsylvania, and the revered, ailing, 81-year-old Benjamin Franklin. Delegates kept drifting in, and it took until May 25th to reach the required minimum attendance. It was an immensely educated, accomplished, and worldly group of men. Many had served in colonial and state legislatures or the Congress. 8 had signed the Declaration of Independence and 5 the Articles of Confederation. George Washington was unanimously elected presiding officer of the convention. On May 29th, Edmund Randolph, the governor of Virginia, offered the Virginia Plan, written mainly by James Madison. It proposed 2 national houses of Congress, one elected directly by the people, the other by their state legislators. Each state would be represented according to its population, which angered states with fewer citizens, as they felt they would be underrepresented. The plan was hotly debated. About 2 weeks later, William Paterson offered the New Jersey Plan, which was basically a revised version of the Articles of Confederation. It envisioned a national assembly consisting of one house, where each state would have one vote, regardless of its population. Alexander Hamilton presented his own plan, proposing that the Congress would be elected only by the people, not by the states. It was also advocated a lifetime term for the president, who would have powers similar to the British monarchs. All 3 plans recommended 3 branches of government: executive, legislative, and judicial, which would limit the power of any one branch. The debates were endless and often heated. Tempers flared, and before June was out, the convention was deadlocked between large and small states, mainly over whether smaller states would be equally represented in the Congress. Eventually, the Great Compromise was adopted, calling for a House of Representatives and a Senate. In the House, states would be represented according to their population, and in the Senate, each state would have equal numbers of representatives. Because small states worried about being weakened, the compromise also guaranteed that slaves would count towards their population totals, but that only 3/5 of each state's slaves would be counted, a decision that has disturbed many people to this day, as it is often seen as calling each slave 3/5 of a person. In addition, Native Americans who paid no taxes, that is, those living on reservations, were not included. The Constitution drafted. A committee of detail was appointed to draw up the Constitution. And while this was being done, the weary delegates took a 10-day break. When they reconvened, all was not harmonious. Furious arguments flared up over the regulation of trade, which had been one of the key reasons for the convention, and over the commercial, moral, and emotional question of slavery. Washington and Madison were among the numerous slave-owning delegates. However, as before, a compromise was reached by the worn-out delegates, who were ready to go home after months of intense labor. They decided to allow the importation of slaves until 1808. The first draft of the Constitution was presented on August 6th, and the final version emerged 5 weeks later. Gouverneur Morris polished the wording and thereby became known as the man who wrote the Constitution. He came up with the preamble's elegant first words, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union." The convention ordered the Constitution to be inscribed on parchment. 2 days later, on September 17th, the Constitution of the United States was signed, though only by 39 delegates. 3 adamantly refused, and others had returned home already. Individual rights. But this was not the end, for to become the law of the land, the Constitution had to be approved by 9 states, and that was easier said than done. The main problem was that the fundamental rights of individuals, entitling them to be free from oppression by their government, had barely been considered at the convention and were hardly mentioned in the Constitution at all. Since most delegates were convinced that these rights were sufficiently safeguarded under state laws. There were 2 camps, the Federalists, in favor of approving the Constitution, and the Anti-Federalists, who opposed it. Thomas Jefferson, in Paris as minister to France, which was headed towards its own world-shaking revolution, wrote to the Federalist James Madison that a Bill of Rights was needed and was what the people are entitled to against every government on earth. By January 1788, only 5 states had agreed: Connecticut, Delaware, Georgia, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. That was not enough for ratification. Early in February, Massachusetts ratified the Constitution by a close vote of 187 to 168, and then only after the Federalists agreed to a list of amendments securing the rights of the people. New Hampshire could not make up its mind, and tiny Rhode Island turned down the Constitution flatly late in March. Maryland, to everyone's surprise, ratified toward the end of April. South Carolina followed in May, and New Hampshire, the required 9th state, ratified in June. A Constitution for a New Nation. James Madison and Alexander Hamilton tirelessly kept up the fight in Virginia and New York, which, with the promise of additional rights amendments, approved the Constitution in June and July. In November 1789, North Carolina became the 12th state to ratify after Congress proposed a Bill of Rights, and on May 29, 1790, determined little Rhode Island made it 13. But its vote, even then, was 34 to 32. On December 15, 1791, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, known as the Bill of Rights, were ratified. The enormous task began in Philadelphia 4.5 years earlier was triumphantly completed. The name of the gifted scribe of the Constitution was forgotten until 1937, when, in preparation for its 150th anniversary, it was discovered that Jacob Shallis, assistant clerk of the Pennsylvania General Assembly, had transcribed the text. Whose quill wrote the Bill of Rights, enshrined in the nation's capital with the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, is not known to this day. In 1789, the year George Washington was inaugurated as the first president of the United States, Benjamin Franklin wrote to a friend, "Our Constitution is in actual operation. Everything appears to promise that it will last, but in this world nothing is certain but death and taxes." As so often before, wise, witty Dr. Franklin, Philadelphia's first citizen, was right again. Thank you.